Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Brian, and I work at the Washington Post on our design system team.
I'm Arturo Silva. Also work on the design system team with Brian.
We're really excited to share with you all this presentation and what we've learned over the past year as we shipped our design system. The presentation is really geared for anyone who's building out their design system today or looking to revamp theirs. It also gives a little bit of insight on how a design system can play a crucial role in the design and dev handoff process. But before we start, let's do a little proper introduction. So again, my name is Brian, and I am a senior product designer and a developer at the Post. Some of my hobbies include mountain biking, nature photography, and I also like to design and develop games. But I very much like drawing cartoons like the one you see here.
Yeah, and I'm Arturo Silva. I'm a technical architect for the Washington Post. My hobbies include cooking and photography like Brian. We're also a big fan of dogs. You can see there, my dog Sully, he's become the unofficial mascot for our team. So now we've done proper introductions, let's go into why we have a design system here at the Post and why it makes sense for us. So you can see here this web here, Spider-Man movie, great movie there. This web of verticals where we have an article, vertical, homepage vertical, a search engines vertical, newsletter vertical. So all these teams are orientated toward their own product goals, really super indexing on what they need to do for that year, for the year. They need to build on top of a foundation, which it became a design system for us. So with that foundation, we needed to have very strong opinions about what needed to be shared across all of these teams, like buttons, images, headlines, headline texts, videos, newsletter signups. It became very much a community of components. I like to call it our community garden here at the Post. And that was about the first year of the design system. That was about 2020 was our first year of doing this. So the next year, 2021, became a traditional year, which Brian will go into now.
This past year for us was, like many teams, hard. We were still working remotely and still dealing with the ongoing pandemic. And even so, we decided to make it a year of transition. We transitioned from Sketch and InVision to Figma and Zeppelin. We worked to build out a fluid component library that's deeply tied to code, doubling down on the usage of tools like Storybook. And as we mentioned, we also officially rolled out what we're calling our V0 design system. With all these things that are happening in the past year, you can imagine that there were a lot of things we learned. And we're here to share with you all some of those key learnings. One of the first things that we actually learned was one of the most important things, that design systems are really around relationships and the relationship between design and development, especially those. When we think about design systems, we typically think about the visual components that make up a design system, like what will this button look like, or how should this input be styled, or what color should this error state be? And really the most important question, like who's building this thing? But really, those things, while they're important, they're only account for a small portion of what makes up a design system. What I mean by that is if your design system doesn't solve a problem for your team or improve the dynamics between your team and what it's actually doing, then what is it actually doing? We had to take a step back and learn about the many pain points for our teammates and their experiences. For example, on the design side, it wasn't uncommon for designers to build out designs that were in contrast what was available in development. You would hear things from developers to say, oh, that is not actually available, or that's not how our button looks like, or that isn't possible at this time. And you can imagine it caused a little bit of friction and unintentional tension. So for us, we needed to really figure out how could the design system help play a role in easing and bettering those relationships. We learned that our design system needed to really attack those three key points of which we identified as pain points for our teams. The first was we needed to break down silos. And that means everyone needs to not only be on the same page, but they need to know that they're on the same team. The design system, because it's at the nexus of things, is really a place where we can actually be the unifying bridge across a lot of different teams and across disciplines. So we wanted the design system to be playing a part where we could actually help build up a better teammate kind of kumbaya, so to speak, between devs and engineers. The second thing we knew we needed to figure out was that we needed to mirror the relationship of which we wanted other people to reflect. Again, because the design system is at the nexus of a lot of different teams, we had to mirror what that relationship looked like for others. And so Art and I, we work really closely. I listen to his design considerations, even though he's a developer. And he listens to my approach on development, even if it's not the way that we're going to go. The reason why this is important is that even though we don't agree all the time, it allows us to have a conversation around what we're building and how we're building it and come to a consensus of which we both felt like we contributed to. And that's really important when we're talking about other people to really work closer together. The last thing is staying flexible. This is super important because even though we have this great design system that works on paper and we talk about how it could really be collaborative, we still needed to allow the teams to do their own thing. We didn't want to come down with an iron fist and say, hey, you need to use this system. We wanted to still give the ability to experiment and have flexibility around what they wanted to do as a team and contribute to the design system when needed. And ultimately, that's just going to save your sanity, especially if you're a small team like ours. The second thing that we learned was we really needed to identify what we're calling our philosophies. Now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly is a philosophy? Essentially, that means identifying the pillars and the core values that your design system is built around, and that will shape pretty much every system decision that you make moving forward. I know it sounds intimidating, but like many who are in the process of building out their design system, we looked at industry examples. Those examples include, for us, Adobe Spectrum, Carbon Design, Material Design, and they're really, really great. Their principles and their philosophies all work for their own reasons, and they work perfectly for them, but they didn't necessarily work for us. I mean, sure, we took and adapted pieces of their lessons, of like lessons learned, but we also ultimately had to shape our own philosophy. So before we even got to that point, we were frustrated looking at all these systems, trying to figure out which one was the best fit for us. It caused us to move in a lot of different directions. And at times we felt like we weren't going anywhere. Sometimes it felt like we were going in circles. But truthfully, when I look back, we went everything that we went through, kind of exploring all these paths, it just made it feel better. And it was ours because we learned so much of what we needed. Remember that perfection, if you're waiting for it, it's the enemy of progress. Finding the right fit for your team is an ever-growing process, and being comfortable with iteration, growth, and failure will get you further than trying to make a cultural shift from the design and dev process. For us, it started with just auditing our components, things that already existed. We learned about what worked for our team, what didn't work for our team, and componentized as we went along. We inherited what we call the unspoken system that many of us have. That means like the fonts that everybody's using, the styles that everybody's kind of referring to, or that button that somehow everybody's using but hasn't been standardized yet. We took all those things and documented what we could. And then we were able to actually sink our teeth into actually defining and shaping our philosophies and growing as we learned more and more about what worked and what didn't work, what were great patterns and what wasn't. And so with all that, we were able to shape out a philosophy that really began to shape and work for us.
So with that, we want to maintain a holistic approach when it comes to implementation. So we want to build on top of those philosophies that we've already documented, that we already have strong opinions about, to make sure that when we develop a new component or update a component, we are referencing this holistic approach. So our third takeaway is we want to maintain a holistic approach when it comes to implementation. That means working together as a team, develop a working agreement between engineering and design. That means documenting a one-pager. One-pager, what we call here, is a Figma document with all of the expectations from the design team and the development team, documenting the behavior, the anatomy of the component, the color choices, the prop APIs, what is actually, what is a checklist for shipping this component? We have about, I think, 15 actual check items on that list. We make sure that we actually go through and make sure that the component documentation has that. Next slide. So you can see here a brief or high-level overview of that one page I just talked about. It shows the behavior, the anatomy, the do's and don'ts. We found that this would be really helpful for designers when they develop a component to have this as a boilerplate, have a template for them to build on top of. And with that, we document the prop APIs, and that's translated into the Figma component, the Zeppelin component, and the storybook documentation. Brian?
Thanks, Art. The next thing that we really wanted to bring up as a key learning was the handoff process. We figured that this handoff process really needed to be super intentional. What I mean by that, you might be thinking to yourself, what does a handoff have to do with design systems? Or what does design system have to do with design and dev operations? Well, what we found was that our teams were going through a lot of different things that made it difficult for handing off a design. Early on, before we even had a design system, things that were happening were designers were actually creating out, these really great designs and handing them over to development, only to find that some of those things didn't exist and they had to go back to the drawing board. Or, when they actually handed things off, developers weren't sure what was final and what was actually existing. And so what ended up happening was that we realized the design system could play a role in actually improving this handoff process. When we think about handoff, it typically is something that plagues our industry when we talk about throwing it over the fence. What I mean by that is the designer would just design in silo, meaning they would work and create their designs. And then when it's ready, they just kind of hand it off to the developer. The developer works and starts working on things, maybe asking minimal questions, but the designer never really gets to see or be a part of that process until it's time for what we call the VQA portion. And this caused a lot of problems because it seemed like sometimes the designer was talking one thing and the developer was talking another. And the issue was that, sometimes they were talking right past each other, or they were talking about the same thing, but referring to them in different ways. The design system allowed us to offer a kind of unified language or a place of reference where developers and designers can talk on a place where it makes more sense. What I mean by that is that we utilized something what we call a shared space. Designers work in Figma, and it's really great. And Figma allowed them to work really, really fast. But it also didn't necessarily offer a space for engineers to really contribute in the way that they like. Likewise, engineers work in code and GitHub, and designers are not in that space. And sometimes some designers feel comfortable being in there, while others not necessarily. So what we found was that we needed a place where it was a bit of an equal kind of shared space to talk about designs and development. And so what we ended up choosing is obviously going with Zeppelin. Zeppelin allowed us to actually build a place where what we call a shared space. And because we designed our design system to be deeply rooted in code, we were able to build out custom extensions and require designers and developers to reference the design system within Zeppelin. It allowed a quick conversation between designers and developers to have around what is actually new and what isn't. For example, you can see in this example, there's these kind of the new feature, which is the highlighted connected code components. In those components, you can take at a glance to see, okay, what is it that I need to work on that's going to be a new feature and what isn't? And developers and designers can confidently know that when a designer is pulling from our Figma UI kit and uploading to Zeppelin, they know that there's going to be some corresponding code that exists on the Zeppelin side for developers to see. And this was super helpful when we talk about improving the handoff process, because it was no longer about, I'm unsure if this button is the right way, or maybe it also gave the power to designers to actually talks a little bit about the language, because we talked no longer about code specifically, but maybe some class names or some spacer sizes or some component names where both developers and designers are talking the same thing, and even talking about the component API, of which Art mentioned earlier. So the handoff process was looking to be a lot smoother, and we were hoping that with this, it would help in that kind of discoverability and figuring out where these components were connected to and how they can learn more about it. And what turns out is that designers and developers were super excited when we onboarded Zeppelin, and the features themselves have been really greatly improved. And even Art and ourselves, we built out these custom extensions as we're looking to roll out our new V1 of our design system, even building upon further connecting, things like class names and styles and tokens and so on.
Yeah, so our fifth takeaway here, we want to encourage other teams to create their own SubDesign systems. Something that we learned over the last year and a half was that we were trying to be the one-stop shop for all component development here at the Post. So teams were introducing their own variants of a component that necessarily wouldn't be used by another team like articles. So we're introducing these components that became very bloated, very costly from a maintenance point of view, because we need to support homepage use cases, article use cases, and another team's use cases. So after some long thinking with Brian and I and other teams here, we decided to encourage teams to create their own SubDesign systems. With these SubDesign systems, they didn't need to add their component into our system. They could build on top of our system. So you can see in the diagram on the right there, we will have an articles SubDesign system and a homepage SubDesign system. It's a really mouthy word there, but it means that they're building on top of our foundations. And they're building on top of our best practices too, like Brian was talking about earlier. We use Storybook very well here. We have very strong opinions about how to develop in it. And we have a Zeppelin integration, which is great with connected components. So with all of that, we've tried to package it up into documentation and guides for onboarding. And we have in the code bases, we have repo templates for teams who might necessarily not know a lot about how to develop a component library for NPM, or there's a lot in that. So we created a template for them. And we also created Figma one-pager templates for them to use to make it, not that intimidating.
One of the last points that we wanted to share with you all, which isn't the only one that should be remembered, but it is a very important one. It is that starting and building and maintaining a design system is a lot of work, and it only accounts for about 30 to 40% of the actual work. What I mean by that is I would argue that your team's probably going to spend more of its time in adoption. And I'm here to tell you that road to adoption isn't a paved one. And there's a lot, and I mean a lot of things that you and your design system team will need to do in order to get your design system adopted. For one, if your company can do it, I'm 100% an advocate for a dedicated core group that maintains your design system. And I know you probably heard yeah, you can build it up via community, but I would be lying if I were to tell you that it would be done fairly quickly that way. The truth is, no one will have time to make those core decisions, and more importantly, advocate for the design system for it to be fostered and adopted into projects. We did a lot of things over the past year to help our specific adoption of the design system, and we found that no one thing actually works, but we were able to kind of distill and figure out the 3 things that we felt like were pretty good for our team and what worked for us. The first thing that really, really worked is an open line of communication. And this is super important. I know you hear this kind of cliche that communication is key. And I know we hear that a lot, but we really mean that. I can not stress that enough, because we're not just talking about pushing out release notes or just pushing out release notes in your Figma library or a quick Slack ping to the team. We're talking about real communication. And that means, meeting your teams and intersecting and interjecting and putting yourself inside different other project, maybe meetings, maybe joining a project kickoff that, maybe hasn't incorporated a design system yet, but you're sitting in, listening in, and contributing and giving feedback of where it could be. For design, we have critiques, every twice a week. And in there, I'm able to interject and say, hey, have you thought about this in the system, or have you referenced this? Interjecting and meeting where your teams are at is actually super important. And we consider that a huge portion of our communication. We also take all communication, everything, especially in this remote world where you have hundreds of Slack channels. We have one Slack channel. And over the course of this past year, we've pushed everyone into there, whether you're a product designer, product manager, engineer, or stakeholder, we want you in there. And anything that's happening for the design system is happening in there. And what that means is that when someone asks for a feature request or maybe some kind of improvement on the design system, we make it a requirement that they have to post a message, which we've designed in our Slack workflow to be done in Slack. And that pings the whole channel, as in everyone can read exactly what is that request. The reason why we have it this way is because not everybody can jump in on a daily meeting that we're having, or not everyone can jump in for the latest changes to the design. But someone at the end of the day could look at our Slack channel and read about some of the changes that might be coming online. And we actually have that as a requirement so that other people in the community can take their 2 cents and say, hey, actually, I've used this in my project. I think this would be really helpful. Or actually, I've resolved this way. And what we found was over the year that the community became a place where it actually was other people helping resolve each other's issues or trying to solve different ways of using the design system components to create these new features. Which leads us to our second point. That's building up partnerships and advocacies within teams. We call those people design system ambassadors. They're like the huge cheerleaders for us. I mean, Art and I were only really two people on our team. We have a product manager and a scrum lead, but that's it. I mean, we serve a huge portion of designers and a huge portion of engineers, and it's a lot for us to be everywhere at once. So these ambassadors are super crucial to our success and for the success of the design system for a few reasons. The first is that when Art and I are not around, and maybe we're on vacation, which we should rightfully have, we should be able to be okay to say our team's got it, our ambassadors got it. They'll be able to help foster that community and that piece of like resolving what I'm having an issue about Figma, how do I resolve this? Or I'm having an issue in code, where do I resolve this? And we've witnessed that over the course of the year. And it's been really, really great and awarding to us where we sometimes don't need to say anything and it gets resolved with the community. To do this does take a lot of time. And for us, what it means is knowledge sharing. Art and I tend to do a lot of one-on-ones ad hoc, where we just sit down with that person who's having an issue and we just talk with them, resolving that issue, but also empowering them to figure out how they could resolve future issues by pointing them to the resources. We also do a weekly office hours where we invite anybody to come and they could just talk about either geek out and nerd out on design systems with us, or talk about a real problem that they're having in their project and how the design system can or is maybe not resolving it at that time. And we talk about solutions there. So all these things are super crucial when we're talking about maintaining that design system and how it gets adopted. The last piece, super crucial, and I'm sure you're aware of, is documentation. Documentation is so essential. And if you could do it from the start, you should definitely do it immediately. Write whatever you can, even if it's on a paper doc, even if it's on, a scratch pad somewhere that people can actually access and see it. And for you and your team to also read and iterate and grow from. Our documentation took a couple evolutions this course of the year. It first started with just like being in a very doc oriented, like a paper doc, moved into like this Figma single design spec. Then we moved into Confluence. Then we just relied on Storybook for a while. And then after that, we just kind of went all in and said, we're going to create our own documentation website, which was super important for us because we wanted to build a system that is, in a sense, in the absence of Art and I, can exist and grow without us. And I know that might find like a really weird way of going about it when you think about like, well, I need my job security kind of thing. Well, we want to build a system that actually works. And for that to work, we know we did a good job if the documentation allows people to find the knowledge that they're looking for, or at least give them the direction to build upon and grow in the system themselves. So documentation is super crucial, and I can't stress it enough. And I know that all these things, even despite doing them all throughout the year, our adoption rate is still, something that we're working on, and we're working for a lot of teams to do. There's a lot of friction that you'll come against, and that's okay. It's okay to sound like a broken record or to feel like the design system police and say, hey, are you using the design system? Or this is how you're not using it correctly. Or, hey, that's not our button, this is, or this is our icon, so to speak. And that's okay, because eventually people will come around and they will be those advocates to say, this is the design system, this is how we use it. And they'll be doing it on your behalf. And you'll sound less like a cop and more of like a teammate playing along with everyone else. So definitely take the time to work on adoption and plan ahead of time that it's going to take a huge portion and it won't happen overnight. But when it starts happening, it's a really great feeling.
And now we'll leave you with a parting thought. So design systems, in our opinion, are not products. They're platforms which we build upon. So here at the Post, when we first started this project over a year and a half ago, we started referring to it as a community garden. So that idea was trying to be melded into what a product or something that a product team could ship. What we learned is that we were trying to, fit a circle into a square hole. It wasn't really matching together. It wasn't really fitting together. We were trying to meet up with KPIs, a bunch of other product terms here I'm sure you all know about. We were trying to do all of that. we really needed to think about it as a platform. So people build on top of it to build their systems. And there's different ways we can measure how they use the platform. But that's how we want to think about design systems, is there platforms for which we all build upon of. Thank you.
Thank you for joining in on our talk. And we hope that some of the things that we've learned will help you in your journey as you look out to build your own design system in the coming year.